I'm Lieutenant Colonel Trinidad Chavez, today's host of Thinking Inside the Box. The Gauntlet, the podcast of operations group at the National Training Center, Fort Irwin, part of the NTC's Warrior Chronicles. The Gauntlet drives warfighting by talking to leaders from our joint force, talking about the crucible of ground combat, leadership, training, and fighting at the crown jewel of our Army. In today's episode, we'll look through the lens of a maneuver battalion and examine some key observations and best practices in the planning and preparation phase of the operations process and how the application of these fundamentals contribute to effective execution in large-scale combat operations here at the National Training Center. I'm sitting down with a distinguished group of subject matter experts whose job it is to observe, assess, coach, and educate the force. Gentlemen, welcome, and please introduce yourselves.
I am Captain Matthew Hansen. I've been a battalion staff trainer for 5 months on Tarantula team. Prior to that, I was a company trainer for a little over a year. And previously, I was part of 310 Mountain Patriot Brigade at Fort Polk and served on brigade and battalion staffs for approximately a year and a half.
Hello, Captain Gabriel Abreu, Tarantula Niner. I'm the S2 OC. Served 5 months at NTC, and previously I've served as a Battalion S2 in the 82nd Airborne Division.
Sergeant First Class Essig. I'm the Battalion Fire Support Trainer. I've been at NTC just hit a year, and my previous assignment was the Brigade Fires Operations NCO at 3rd Brigade, 101st.
Let's jump right into the discussion. The military decision-making process, or MDMP, is the battalion's primary tool to plan operations. When you boil MDMP down to its essence, it helps commanders and their staffs identify problems, helps them see themselves, the enemy, and the terrain, and create solutions in the form of a synchronized, suitable, feasible, acceptable, and complete plan. What are some of your observations as battalions navigate through this 7-step process?
Some of the observations that I've had over the past few rotations is we got to have staffs and commanders come out with an understanding after the MDMP process. So it's more than just a step-by-step thing that we just hit. We got to come out with some sort of understanding of what goes on and how this plan is actually going to function. So our planning process is going to hit some roadblocks along the way. It's based off of limited time available, staff exhaustion, shift work, varying levels of experience, effects from enemy contact, whether that be indirect fires, drones, etc. But we must come out with a plan that gets some sort of understanding across the board on how we're going to conduct operations.
You talk about junior staff and a staff with limited experience. How do we overcome some of those frictions?
So a couple recommendations. First off, we got to have SOPs or standard operating procedures available or doctrine readily available to reference. These are great tools for people to look at, work off of, look at the lists of things that we have to do because it is a lot in MDMP. I'm an experienced planner and I still reference off a lot of these products myself. And staffs that really get a lot of detail into their plan are the ones that have an SOP or doctrine available to look at. And the other thing staffs can do is get to some good training prior to NTC. So really focusing on putting the staff through that next rep of MDMP. Staffs and inexperienced people on your staff learn the best from the feedback they get from the field grades, the feedback they get from the battalion commander during the major briefs, producing the products and getting that iterative feedback, getting spot checked and making corrections along the way.
I think it's imperative that you have those resources that are readily available, those products. You also mentioned staff fatigue, right? I'll take it a step further. You also have to have systems and processes in place. There's a saying, people get tired, systems and processes don't, right? So when people get tired, there's still a system, there's still a process, and there's somebody that we could put in that place that is not fatigued, that could still execute that process if there is a system in place. There's a phrase, start with a red pen, that customarily begins with mission analysis. What are some important fundamentals to consider during mission analysis?
Effective staffs tell the enemy story. So you communicate to the commander an understanding of the enemy. What are the ends, ways, and means? So the ends being the end state, what are they trying to achieve? Are they trying to destroy, disrupt? Their overall intent. And then the ways are tactical tasks, and you depict those as intent graphics on your situational templates. You're going to also want to describe how long it's going to take for them to achieve these tasks. So you do that by visually showing, your time phase lines, time distance analysis, list out decision points, list out all of the probable lines of contact. And then the means are those critical capabilities and formations that the enemy has in order to achieve that end state. Ultimately, a best practice is always maintain constant communication with Brigade S2, particularly the all-source technician. They're ultimately responsible for the entire enemy COA for the brigade, and then it's on you as that battalion staff to then not simply transpose that and copy and paste it, but do additional analysis and template that with the terrain and the ultimate scheme of maneuver for that particular formation that you're going to face.
You really delve deep into IPOE, which is part of mission analysis, right? And being able to tell the enemy story through ends, ways, and means. Also being able to understand the various methods of contact that we will potentially encounter, and that's based off of probable lines of contact. What are some other aspects during mission analysis that are important fundamentals to consider?
To consider for the staff itself is to be synchronized and collaborate between ourselves. So what Captain Abreu just was talking about is a bunch of stuff, and it can't just be the S2 section that nugs away at or works on all the outputs of IPOE. So great staffs are the ones where you see all the warfighting functions around the table, the map, the next product that they're working on. They're talking back and forth, and they're leaning on each other's expertise and experience to get that put into IPOE.
One of those tools I think that helps staff collaboration is the running estimate. And it's not just data. Oftentimes running estimates are data, and oftentimes running estimates don't get updated. The very successful units continuously update their running estimates by warfighting function, as well as not just talking about the data, but what are the so what's, what are the key takeaways? And once you get to a certain point in the planning process, what are those recommendations to plan against?
Right. And those recommendations and those so what's all come from your experience. So if you're just transposing, just like what he said, what are the facts? What are your specified tasks that you're going with? That doesn't get at the actual, are you leveraging your experience into the plan?
Another way of driving staff collaboration is relative combat power assessment, or RCPA. A way of looking at relative combat power assessment is through the war fighting functions from the lens of friendly forces as well as through enemy forces, right? So we are looking at strengths and weaknesses for both friendly and enemy forces by those war fighting functions, and determine where we have overmatch, where we have parity, or where we are overmatched by the enemy. And that's also going to drive some of the risks that we knew identified during step 2 of the military decision-making process, mission analysis. As we talk about reverse IPOE and staff collaboration, what role does the FIRE's warfighting function play in a mission analysis?
Fires is going to want to identify not only where the enemy is, but what they're trying to target. So they're going to identify what they think the enemy's high payout target list is going to be. Essential fire support tasks and fire support tasks they're going to try to utilize to enable their scheme of maneuver. And we want to identify any possible friction points for us as well. Just maybe we need to ask for a higher echelons to fill in that gap. Maybe a recommendation would be like, I need more FA targets possibly in the future. We see a possible friction point coming up.
You bring up a really good point. Reverse IPOE for the fire's warfighting function isn't simply just putting rings on a map. It is building out the enemy fire plan that is nested with the ends or the goals that Tarantula 09 talked about earlier in describing ends, ways, and means and telling that story. And I think oftentimes the fire's warfighting function during reverse IPOE just limits themselves to putting some enemy rings based off of enemy threat capabilities of indirect fires.
Trying to paint a picture for the commander, just like the doctrine states, like a target is an entity or object that performs a function on the battlefield that is considered for prosecution. We're trying to tell the commander in this process, like what targets the enemies are actually going to try to execute and prosecute for friendly forces, and then potentially where they're going to try to execute these.
Commanders drive the planning process. A few of those ways are through a clear commander's intent, which doctrinally is comprised of an expanded purpose, key tasks, not specified tasks, and an end state. Additionally, initial and continuous updates to planning guidance by warfighting function is critical. Developing and issuing evaluation criteria if it's going to be multiple courses of action, as well as providing as much detail as possible if it's a directed course of action. After mission analysis helps us understand the enemy and the terrain, we begin to build a plan and COA development. Applying some of those outputs from mission analysis, what are some important fundamentals to apply during the course of action development?
The best way to start COA dev is where we just ended in mission analysis. That means taking everything we just produced and worked on in MA, which was a big effort, and bringing it over. So we're taking the enemy sit temp, the COA statement, OA coke, our Modified Combined Obstacle Overlay, our MCOO, running estimates, commander's planning guidance, commander's intent to include the expanded purpose key tasks and end state, and specified implied tasks along with our forces available. So when we're talking about gathering the tools, it's everything we just did, all the analysis we just produced in the previous step. We're overlaying all the things that we got from our higher headquarters, looking at adjacent units, other agencies we're working with. And when I looked in doctrine prior to this podcast, one of the things it said, and I thought it was pretty good, was if we're not gathering the tools, we're going to make premature conclusions about things just based off bad assumptions or assumptions that are not up to date. So gathering the tools and gathering the facts get staffs after using planning assumptions that are supported by those facts.
Bringing over all our running estimates, making sure our running estimates are updated and applying that to our course of action development is critical, is what I understood you saying. One of the 5 criterias of course of action development is a complete plan, a complete concept. What are some of those things that complete the plan?
We talk about a complete plan. It just can't be something slapped on a map that we just generated, in a short amount of time. There's a process, and it's AGADAP CS. So that's assessing your relative combat power, generating options, arraying your forces, developing a broad concept, assigning that headquarters, producing the COA statement and COA sketch, conducting your COA brief, and selecting that actual COA. So when we see successful units run through that process, they're going to actually come out with something on the back end that's workable for the next step. So when they assess their relative combat power, it's going to be based off an enemy they're going to fight and doing a correlation of forces and means, COFAM analysis that lines with our 3-to-1 odds that we're trying to achieve. And it's going to consider all the forms of contact or the more probable ones we're going to see. When they start to generate their options, they're going to work off a decisive point and work backwards. That decisive point is going to be decided on by the staff and by the commander just based off the terrain and enemy that we're making our assessment off of. We're going to weight our main effort when we array our forces, and that goes back into understanding the risk of what enemy is placed where and what are they trying to achieve. When they go into developing their broad concept, they're going to do so in detail because they got good commander's guidance. They're going to bring all the products over, and they're not just going to be guessing on what they're trying to do. See the most challenges, and sometimes this is based off of time or experience, are the ones that draw some extra boundaries onto their higher headquarters, ones that they've already produced, TRPs that align generally with a shift fire plan, draw some axes of advances that doesn't correlate with the terrain on the ground, and just throw a company right onto a fight where they don't understand the enemy.
Oftentimes we associate mission analysis with the S2 shop and course of action development with the S3 shop. Course of action development cannot be limited to the S3 shop. Just like mission analysis, that has to be collaborative. You can't limit course of action development to the movement and maneuver warfighting function. We got to make sure in order to complete that plan, it encompasses all 6 warfighting functions. That's one of the criteria to develop a complete plan. You touched on weighting the main effort, prioritizing fires, and building the plan backwards. I would go one step forward and starting with what is the end state based off of the commander's intent with respect to friendly forces, the enemy, and the terrain, and then building back from that end state to ensure that you capture that phase of the operation for consolidation of gains and transition. Course of action development is also complete when we're able to identify some of those risks and ways to mitigate that. Fires enables maneuver. What are some important applications from the fires warfighting function during course of action development?
For COA Dev, one of the first things we're doing now is we're integrating the fire support triggers to the scheme maneuver. And now we are actually placing targets with help from S2 for where the enemy we think they're going to be, and then obviously the scheme maneuver to the essential fire support task and the fire support task by phase.
Essentially nesting our fire support tasks to support what our plan is, right? In your experience, any observations in target placement, oversaturation of planned targets during course of action development?
Oversaturation is a typical thing I'll see. The old saying, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So if you have 30 targets for a phase, it's getting more complex and it's harder to actually execute and get the actual proper trigger timing with the scheme maneuver.
Yeah, I know there's no set number of targets for offensive operation or a defensive operation, but is there a rule of thumb or a starting point to shift off of when conducting course of action development?
For COA Dev, placing targets by phase, I try to limit to no more than 10, and 10 is even a high number. That includes your battalion targets and any brigade targets that you're also allocated.
I would say that if you're applying the science of it, those targets are limited based off of the resources and the capabilities that you have. Organic indirect fire capabilities, as well as what you just mentioned, brigade or higher indirect fires capabilities. So I would say using the science based off of resources capabilities, that's going to give you a general idea of how many targets you could plan for each phase of the operation. We also talked about a complete plan from a fires perspective. How do you ensure that the plan is complete?
Yeah, so I always coach the RTU planning up to, onto, and beyond the objective. It's not just a phrase we say, like we're planning up to the objective. How are we enabling maneuver to actually conduct movement and transition into maneuver? Do we need fires to the line of departure in order to enable that? And then on the objective, do we need to consider echelonment of fires? Do we need to consider maybe a short duration with intense volume on the objective? That's going to really cover your essential fire support task and fire support task in that phase. And then for the risk estimated distance in that, are we shifting to enable suppression still? It's not just one target that's suppression and then we're done. Like we want to maintain suppression to enable the maneuver. Example would be, combined arms breach. Enable the maneuver that company to pull engineers up. We have obscuration, and then we still have suppression with indirect fires and also direct fires. And then beyond the objective, once we have consolidated our gains, do we need to prepare to disrupt or delay a retreat from the enemy? Do we need to start preparing avenues of approach for maybe a counterattack that's going to be coming? These are something to consider.
I wouldn't limit beyond the objective to just consolidation of gains and transition, but there could be a commitment of a reserve. So we need those fires to have some type of effect on either a commitment of a reserve or potentially another echelon of forces moving up to our objective. So not necessarily just for the consolidation and reorganization of the operation, but also we need fires beyond the objective to ensure that we are able to achieve our tactical task on that objective.
Yes, because once we are establishing a defense, coming up with a new fires plan for a defense, it's very time consuming. So if you're planning beyond the objective for that, you're just executing the planned movements and getting the observers and mortars in position that you need to actually achieve this.
Okay, and it's not just planning the targets, but it's also planning our indirect organic capabilities. It's planning the targets up to, onto, and beyond the objective, but also what is the plan to get the mortars in position, ready to fire, that supports those essential fire support tasks and ultimately enables our maneuver.
With the maneuver piece, am I making sure I'm not driving through an MFP or think I can use some of that space available that sometimes fires needs in conjunction with like the maneuver plan? So in code development, getting that thing started that way helps us all out, make sure that our spacing is good.
In orders production, units develop annexes as well as fighting products, which are critical to synchronizing the operation, massing effects, and provide effective command and control. What are some of those functional fighting products we see battalions produce and utilize?
The definition that helps me with these fighting products, they are a quick reference, either written or visual tools produced during the planning process that capture and summarize key information from the op order and the annexes, and used by commanders, key leaders, and members of staff to assist in decision-making, execution management, and the current assessment of the specific course of action that we're running. So for the maneuver warfighting function, we're going to focus on our graphics, our synchronization matrix or execution matrix, on our decision support template. For discrete operations, we can throw an execution checklist or an X-check in there, and then producing the actual op order as a whole.
For the intelligence warfighting function are the event temp with your NAIs, time phase lines, and enemy decision points, information collection matrix, and then your overall common intelligence picture that has your priority information requirements, your enemy COAs, intel handover line, and then your probable lines of contact and enemy obstacles.
For fires, we have the big four. Fire support overlay, we need that digital and analog. We have the scheme of fires, which includes your concept of fires that has the TT load act by phase, fire support execution matrix, and then the target list worksheet. And then we're also going to finalize brigade and battalion IC fires, intel collection fires rehearsals, and then the technical rehearsals as well.
What is your observations and what are some considerations that are critical when planning transitions?
Ultimately, you need to begin with incorporating all the warfighting functions. And then, do we have security set to enable, especially in this case, the main command post, to conduct resupply, to enable all the staff of each warfighting function to update their running estimates? An example is, refining your PIRs to detect emergent threats, in this case, like a counterattack. Plan out your subsequent locations to jump the main command post, just to name a few.
Ultimately, consolidation of gains allows you to regenerate combat power, improve your fighting position, extend your operational reach, as well as extend your lines of communication. There's an age-old adage, failing to prepare is preparing to fail. One of the key ways a battalion prepares for operations is through rehearsals. The big four for a maneuver battalion is a combined arms rehearsal or a CAR, information collection fires rehearsal or IC fires rehearsal, a fires technical rehearsal, and a sustainment rehearsal. What are some things to consider during these rehearsals?
A terrain model, at the very least, needs to enhance the understanding of the terrain and the enemy that we're going to fight. So it has to show good terrain, and that terrain that we build physically on the ground be built out of some sort of material that's durable, especially out here with NTC. We got some wind, so just your note card sitting on the ground is not going to cut it. It's got to include the enemy because, we're not just fighting a blue plane, we're fighting an enemy. Make sure it's big enough for people to walk around, react to, walk on their avenue of approach in the rehearsal so they can actually see what's going on and how that translates to time and space and your adjacent units around you. The second thing I would say, it needs to be organized. So it's not practice, rehearsed, or organized, or we don't have a good method of doing it beforehand. It's not going to be a very good rehearsal. We're not going to get a very good output. So having some sort of script or format that helps push that along and using our fighting products to help push how we're going to execute this rehearsal along is key. And then finally, just making sure the right people are there for key leaders, commanders.
Yeah, those three things that you touched on are very important. Starting off with the terrain model. When I was a battalion operations officer, we treated a terrain model kit as a pacer item for that staff section, making sure that we were able to build a terrain model in an austere environment. We couldn't rely on what was readily available on ground, right? We had to have those tools with us and we treated it like a pacer item. We did inventories. We continuously refit the terrain model. So I think that's critical in making sure we're able to build a terrain model to facilitate one or all four of those rehearsals that we previously mentioned. Additionally, we shouldn't limit ourselves just to a terrain model. Sometimes we have to execute rehearsals distributed across the battlefield based off of operational requirements. So having different methods to conduct rehearsals, whether that is over a map, a JBCP, or an MMCS digitally over a radio, but making sure that there is a standard operating procedure to execute those rehearsals distributed. Going back to a script, that should be included in their standard operating procedures, but if they don't have an updated standard operating procedures to outline a script, a tool that can be used is the fighting products that we previously mentioned. One or multiple of those fighting products, whether it's the execution checklist, execution matrix, or the sync matrix, could really help synchronize that plan in time and space. It also validates those fighting products. So when you leave those rehearsals, one, your fighting products should be validated, or you identified some modifications or changes that need to be made to those fighting products. And then the third point, having the right people there is also critical. Who is that target audience? At the battalion level, is that target audience the platoon level? If so, does the platoon leaders need to be there? Do they need to be able to talk their scheme maneuver? Do they need to understand and know the triggers if they are the primary observers of a target, as well as any attachments or enablers to include engineers if we're conducting a combined arms breach, being able to discuss and talk that synchronization piece during those rehearsals, as well as elements from all the war fighting functions if it's a combined arms rehearsal.
And you touched about the fighting products present. If your decision support matrix or template is available, then you're just going to automatically hit those contingency plans, which is often another event skipped during rehearsals.
Preparation is continuous until you cross that line of departure. Up to that point, the battalion should be focusing on meeting minimum forces requirements by warfighting function. In layman's terms, do I have enough combat power to accomplish my tactical task in quantifiable terms, like in number of tanks, Bradleys, strikers, weapon systems, squads, mortar systems that are fully mission capable, communication platforms, and systems to communicate across our PACE plan, and are those systems with the right leaders, making sure that we have updated our common intelligence picture, completed our resupply, are our scouts out conducting security and reconnaissance missions. A method to do this is executing a conditions check, go, no-go criteria by warfighting function. That also helps identify risks prior to crossing the line of departure, and it allows for risk mitigation and or risk acceptance. Any parting comments, alibis, or saved rounds?
We got a good planning process, but the time management is key. And at NTC, the time available is going to be scaled up and down just based off of, when are we receiving missions, changes in the enemy. But we still got to try to follow that 1/3, 2/3 rule as best we can, because we still got a company commander and platoon leaders still trying to complete the plan for themselves as well through the troop leading procedures below us that depend on us getting it out to them. So we still got to come up with some understanding of some sort of product that helps our lower echelons out actually execute that mission.
Time management is crucial in order to complete the planning process and facilitate enough time for companies to conduct troop leading procedures parallel to this planning process and afford them the 1/3, 2/3 rule. Time management is continuously changing. A tool that we use is the HOPE timeline, higher operational planning and enemy timeline that needs to be draconianly enforced by the time manager. Oftentimes that's the battalion executive officer or the battalion S3 who is updating each one of those timelines, who is updating the higher headquarters timeline, who is updating the operational and the planning timeline, who's updating the enemy timeline. Oftentimes, the enemy timeline is tasked to the intelligence officer or the S2. The S3 or the AS3 is managing the planning, the operational timeline, as well as the higher headquarters timeline. Those are typically what we see here, but assigning people to the task and then ultimately having an enforcer or a timeline manager being a field grade to make sure that we complete that plan and afford the companies enough time to conduct their troop leading procedures and meet the minimum force requirements prior to crossing the line of departure.
Intel, I think it's important in order to save time, understand your roles and responsibilities of the S2 and staff and the maneuver staff as a whole for IPO. Have that listed out in an SOP you can reference quickly. And then don't wait for a perfect IC plan or mission analysis from brigade. And then continue to update your own running estimates. So you're continuously updating your intelligence picture. So don't simply just sit around and wait to be fed information. You have to actually fight for that information.
NCOs, if you're involved in the planning process, your job is to execute. If you are in that planning process, you understand the plan, you can execute that plan better. I strongly coach the NCOs for fires. Like, if you can take something off the FSO's plate, if you can brief this over here for like a mission analysis brief, try to do it, because then you're going to be more invested in that planning process as well.
Great points. First, let me address the non-commissioned officers topic. They are the special ingredients in our recipe of success and our force multipliers. We certainly can't limit them to only execution. They must be involved throughout the planning process. It's essential to leverage and apply their experience, skill sets, and results-based approach to problem solving. And finally, the plan does not end at step 7 of the military decision-making process. It's a continual process that accounts for an ever-changing operational environment that is predicated off of updated running estimates. To steal a quote from General Eisenhower, he said, "The plan is nothing, planning is everything." You might not always have time to execute MDMP. In a time-constrained environment, I recommend applying the rapid decision-making and synchronization process when needed. Usually, units are very unfamiliar with this 5-step process. In LISCO, RDSP can generate actionable decisions within hours. It certainly requires some staff training, which you could incorporate into your LPDs, as well as heavy commander involvement to drive the process and full staff collaboration, providing the commander real-time understanding of the current and projected battlefield. In today's podcast, we look through the lens of a maneuver battalion and discuss some key observations and best practices in the planning and preparation phase of the operations process, and how the application of these fundamentals contribute to effective execution in large-scale combat operations here at the National Training Center. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for your time and exceptional insight. I look forward to the next time we can sit down and continue our discussion on warfighting. As always, our observers are on your team. I invite you to look for our latest products and subscribe to our Attack Talks on YouTube for our quick hitting lessons. Thank you for listening to Thinking Inside the Box, the Gauntlet, the podcast of Operations Group, part of the National Training Center's Warrior Chronicles. Train the force, lead, train, win.